Mr. President, I'm coming to the floor for the final time to give remarks about the Willow project. I won't explain it. I'll explain it in a little bit in my remarks. The President is getting ready to make a decision, a huge decision on a big project in Alaska, really an inflection point for our state's future. He's likely to make that decision any day, Mr. President. So I'm just going to come down and kind of wrap up the arguments that we've been making. I really want to thank a number of folks. Senator Murkowski, of course, who with me, we've been focused on this issue for 2 years, the entire time of the Biden administration, 2 years, arguments every day, including a meeting with the President last Thursday. Congresswoman Peltola, who's done a really strong job in this regard, particularly in the meeting last week with the President. Some of my Democratic colleagues have been weighing in on this project. I really appreciate that. I know it takes a lot of courage. I'm going to talk about some of the far left, lower 48 environmental groups who don't support it based on nothing, no facts, no data, but to stand up to them, go to the White House and say, come on, Mr. President, come on, Biden administration, you got to give this, you got to make sure Alaska has this. So my Democrat colleagues, I know I'm not going to name you, I don't want to get you in trouble or anything, but thank you. Really, really appreciate this. As I mentioned, Mr. President, we had a meeting with the President last week, and I did, at the beginning of the meeting, in addition to handing the President a unanimous resolution from the entire Alaska legislature, the entire state Senate, entire state House, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Native, non-Native, all passed a resolution to say to the Biden administration, please support the Willow project, 3 pads. Handed that to the President. Then I also handed him this map that describes really the context, as I said to the President, of what's happening in Alaska under this administration. I was respectful. We were in the Oval Office. Of course, you're going to be respectful with the President and his team in the Oval Office. It's a very historic place, obviously. But I said respectfully, Mr. President, it's every region of the state, every industry, oil, gas, mining, hunting, fishing, you name it, there's been 45 executive orders and executive actions. It's now 46. There's been another one since the meeting we had last week. Looking to shut down Alaska. It's exhausting, to be honest. No other state is getting that kind of attention. I walked through some of these, but I just, again, respectfully wanted the President to know that's it. Every time we meet with senior White House officials and say, these are the dates we've met with senior White House officials, saying, hey, how about a ceasefire? We just get more. There's no other state in the country getting this kind of attention. It's unwanted attention. As I've told many of my Democratic colleagues, hey, if a Republican administration came after you like this, singling your state out, putting thousands of people out of work, and you came to me, said, hey, Dan, can you help me? I'd help you. Every Democrat here knows I would help you. So I appreciate the help that we are getting, but that was the context, the meeting, and again, it was respectful. We appreciate it. We had over an hour with the President and his team. He's a busy, busy man, leader of the free world, so we appreciated that. Mr. President, Madam President, I was also recently down in Houston at this very big energy conference called CERAWeek. And to be honest, it's not an exaggeration to say all eyes are on the Willow project, because it's essentially the question that's being posed in our energy sector is this. It was a very good Wall Street Journal editorial last week calling the Willow project a test for President Biden, where this editorial led by saying the President says the only barrier to more U.S. oil production is recalcitrant companies. Okay, a lot of us don't believe that, by the way. So here's an opportunity to say, is that true or not? Because if the Biden administration, the President approves Willow, tonight, ConocoPhillips will start moving people to build it tomorrow, okay? So we are ready. The state's ready. Private sector's ready. So I think that's the key question. And it was the key question down in CERAWeek. Biggest energy conference probably in the world, almost 8,000 attendees. So this is a really important question, not just for Alaska, for America. So, Madam President, I think the key arguments are here, given the President's priorities, what the President emphasizes, what he and his administration talk about, the Willow project is actually exactly the kind of project President Biden and his team should support, because it reinforces so many things that they talk about and care about. Let me just mention 4 of those, Madam President. Number 1, which of course is really important, is this project has the highest environmental standards of any major energy projects in the world by far. This is not even a close call. And how do we know this? Because the Biden administration's own environmental impact statement that came out a month ago says this. It says this. The Trump administration passed this project and their environmental reviews with flying colors. Then it was 5 pads. The Biden administration's EIS, environmental impact statement, took it down to 3. We didn't really like that, but that's about the minimum it could go. And they explained in this administration's own environmental impact statement, the scientists, the career staff, were saying things like the greenhouse gas emissions would be, quote, minimal. Not a climate bomb like these lower 48 far-left groups keep talking about. Minimal. Here's the number. Emissions from this project, according to President Biden's own environmental impact statement, 0.15% for 2019 emission levels. And they call it minimal. They also said if you don't do the Willow project, the market substitution analysis in the Biden administration's own EIS says that then we will likely, we America, will have to go to other countries, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, to get oil. And their environmental records and standards are so bad that the emissions globally from not doing this project will actually rise. That's in the EIS. I've talked about the high standards for Alaska with regard to the highest standards in the world on impacts on the environment. By the way, this project is next to existing infrastructure, so you don't have to build a lot of infrastructure. Trans-Alaska Pipeline, you just plug it in. So, highest environmental standards in the world. How do I know that? Because the Biden administration's environmental impact statement lays it out in about 1,500 pages. So, Madam President, that's one very important argument. That fits with the Biden administration's priorities. Let me give you another one. The Biden administration frequently talks about racial equity, racial justice, environmental justice for people of color, Indigenous people. Okay? They talk about that all the time. Well, the Indigenous people in my state overwhelmingly support this project. There's a few people, and that happens in every state, every country, who are opposed. They're getting a lot of press, by the way. But the vast majority of the people, the First Nations people, Alaska Native people in our state strongly support this. And we held a press conference last week here in the Capitol. Some of the most famous Alaska Native leaders in our state's history flew thousands of miles just to be here to support this. So all this rhetoric from the administration on racial equity, racial justice is going to be very empty if they say, you know what, we're going to choose the Center for Biological Diversity and Greenpeace's priorities in the lower 48 over the priorities of the people who live there. And Madam President, I want to go into this a little bit deeper. This is a quote from the Voice of the Arctic Inupiaq. This is a group of tribes, Native leaders, a really broad-based group of the people who live where this project would be. Here's a quote from Nagruk Harakachuk. Outside activist groups opposing Willows have drowned out local perspective, that's for sure, and are actively working to supersede the views of the Alaska Native people, that's for sure. This is not environmental justice or any kind of justice. It is a direct attack on Alaska Native self-determination. So, Madam President, some of our Native leaders last week were saying, you know what really is infuriating? These lower 48 environmental groups who are all driving the opposition to this project are trying to tell Alaska Natives who have lived in Alaska for thousands and thousands of years how to live and what's good for them. You know what some of our Native leaders are starting to call this? The second wave of colonialism. Eco-colonialism. Condescending, lower 48 environmental groups who don't know anything about Alaska coming up to our state and telling the Native people how to live. Eco-colonialism. By the way, that topic came up in the Oval Office meeting. If the administration is going to listen to lower 48 environmental groups who condescendingly tell Alaska Native people how to live, that's certainly not racial equity. That's certainly not racial justice. That is the definition of eco-colonialism, and I hope that they're not going to go there. Madam President, one other area, another great group of Americans who I love to talk about on the floor, who support this project are the great men and women who build things in America. And there's been no better champion of that in the entire country than the president of the laborers, my good friend Terry Sullivan, who just 2 days ago wrote another letter to the president. He has been such a great advocate. The laborers are the biggest construction union in America. This project will create 2,500 jobs, 75% of which are union jobs, building trade jobs. Madam President, I'd like to submit for the record another great letter from Terry O'Sullivan, this one dated March 6, 2023, to the President of the United States. I'd like to submit it for the record.
Without objection.
So I'm just going to read a few lines from this letter. But Terry O'Sullivan is a very astute man, and he's seeing what's happening in Washington this past couple weeks. Here's what he said. Quote, administration officials are considering limiting Willow's scope to only 2 of the proposed pads. By the way, there's no environmental analysis of that at all in the EIS, in the Trump administration, or the Biden administration. So if they do that, it won't be based on any science, any data. I want to be clear, said Terry O'Sullivan, a limited approval like this of 2 pads in fact, is a rejection of the project. This is what we told the president. This is what we've told his team many, many times. They know that. Proponents of this approach are displaying the kind of con game that has American voters and LIUNA, that's the laborers, members, turning away from established political norms. So this great American, Terry O'Sullivan, he's a working man. He leads working men and women. He's saying, don't play these games. 2 pads is a denial. That was our respectful message last week. What else did Terry O'Sullivan have to say in his final letter to the president? It is time to listen to local leaders, check, workers, for sure, residents, and reject the game playing that press reports indicate is happening behind the scenes in the administration. Keep your commitments, Biden administration, to a rational energy policy that allows for responsible development of domestic energy resources while the nation transitions to a lower emission economy. Terry O'Sullivan, once again, Madam President, weighing in. I can't thank him enough. Sean McGarvey, the building trades. By the way, when we held this press conference last week, every union in Alaska supports this project. The trades, of course, but all the public unions, every single union, 100%. Now again, this administration likes to talk about, hey, we really care about the working men and women, the men and women who build things, the unions. Okay. Let's see where you're at on Willow. Finally, Madam President, I want to talk about an issue that, again, came up in the Oval Office, and that's just the foreign policy ramifications of this upcoming decision. We are in a new era of authoritarian aggression that I talk about a lot. The brutal dictators Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, this guy Maduro in Venezuela, they're on the march. But the one thing they fear almost more than anything is American energy power. Read the reporting. Xi Jinping is scared to death. The dictator of Beijing, scared to death of American energy power. So is Putin, by the way. So, in the last 2 years, because like I said, Senator Murkowski and I have been raising this issue about daily, I have asked in dozens of hearings on the Armed Services Committee, military experts, Biden administration officials, Biden administration military members, do you think it matters and you think it's good for our national security if we have more energy in a project like this? By the way, Willow at max production will produce about 200,000 barrels a day. Every single official in this administration who deals with national security for 2 years, has said yes. Not one has said no. Now, I'm not going to name names. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but it's obvious. This is one of the great strengths of our nation. And our adversaries, the dictators in Moscow and the dictators in Beijing, fear it. So, why do I have this slide up? There's something going on right now, Madam President, that's unbelievable. And every time I've asked anybody, and I've raised it with anybody in this administration, they look at me with a blank stare and don't answer my question. And my question is this. This administration came in, they wanted to limit the production of American energy. Fully disagree with that approach, but what happened? Well, the predictable result happened. You limit supply, prices go up. So prices on energy have gone up on working families for the last 2 years like this. We all know it. Inflation like this. So what have they been doing? They've been going overseas, begging other countries to produce more oil and import it into America. Now, why on earth would you do that when you can do it here? So the latest and greatest, they did it in Saudi Arabia. They were rejected, by the way. They were flirting with Iran. My goodness. The largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and you're even flirting with those guys? With the blood of American soldiers on their hands? Ridiculous. But they went to Venezuela after the election, and they said, let's lift sanctions on you. So we are now importing over 100,000 barrels a day from Venezuela. Can you believe that? That's a fact. Venezuela pollutes in its processes to produce oil. It's a production and greenhouse gas emission process that's 18 times, with an X, times more polluting than in America, and certainly way more polluting, probably 30 times more than the great state of Alaska's Willow project. So you really care about the environment? Why did you just lift sanctions on one of the dirtiest producers in the world? They're a terrorist regime. They have a horrible human rights record, horrible worker rights record, a well-known U.S. adversary, and we're already importing 100,000 barrels a day from them. Just started, and we don't want to produce in Alaska with the highest standards in the world on the environment and workers? So when I ask the question, why would you do that and not let us produce in the great state of Alaska? Like I said, I've never gotten an answer to that question. So hopefully the answer is going to be, well, we are going to help the great state of Alaska with this Willow project. Do it because right now, Madam President, with regard to energy policy, my state is being treated worse than a terrorist regime. And that is not a hyperbole, that is a fact. So, in my final appeal, before this decision is made, respectfully asking this administration, this is exactly the kind of project that we think should be easily supported by this administration, given their priorities. Highest standards in the world on the environment, no doubt about it. Lowest greenhouse gas emissions, negligible, according to the President's own EIS. Racial equity, racial justice. The Native people of Alaska want this. Listen to them. Don't listen to the eco-terrorists down in the lower 48, coastal elites who don't know anything about Alaska and are trying to tell the Native people how to live their lives. Insulting, by the way. Don't listen to the eco-terrorists. Listen to the great union members like Terry Sullivan, all of whose members support and help enhance the national security of America with strong energy policy in the great state of Alaska. I hope the Biden administration does the right thing. So many of my colleagues have helped. I want to thank Senator Murkowski again for her relentless advocacy on this. With me, we'll see. Big stuff for America, giant stuff for my state. I hope they do the right thing for our country, for our workers, for the Native people, for our national security. I yield the floor.